Okay, thank you for the introduction. So the title of my talk is Mosaicism and PGTA, Is It a Red Herring? And the answer is yes. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Disclosures, as you heard, I've started a new company called Genomic Prediction. I'll talk a little bit more about this in my next talk on expanded pre-implantation genetic testing. And so I'm still getting invited to talk about mosaicism, which I actually think is a big waste of everyone's time. And you can imagine I don't get very favorable responses to my lecture. I have sort of a conservative opinion about mosaicism, and I just wanted to show you a few of the comments that I've gotten after I've done these talks. One is, have you published anything? You're cherry-picking data. Do you have your own clinic? And you're being dishonest. That was a tough one. And you can't criticize a New England Journal of Medicine paper. And I will be doing that today. But just for those of you, oh yeah, and I haven't read supplementary data. We'll talk about that as well. Just for those of you who don't know, I actually have published a few papers on mosaicism, and I've just put up some of my colleagues who are considered key opinion leaders in this area. And one of those papers was recently published in Fertility and Sterility. We've heard a little bit about this, and again, I was put on the con side of the argument mostly because of my conservative opinion about how we're using information about mosaicism. But of course, what I really care about is the truth. It's not really debating. It's using scientific evidence to find out what the actual truth is. But I also want to talk about conflict of interest. And so most of the time, people suggest that it's only this side, the people who believe PGS works, that have a conflict of interest because they make money from the process. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about both sides having some conflict of interest. For example, regulations in different countries can impact your ability to have an unbiased opinion on whether or not PGS works. So, for example, in Germany, where for a long time it hasn't been possible to do aneuploidy testing on a blastocyst, those people in that country can travel to a different country where it is possible. So people operating IVF clinics in Germany will not benefit from saying that something actually works when they can't do it themselves. And so you would have to travel to a different country. Those people would not make as much money if they were to suggest a technique actually works when, again, they can't do it themselves. Another potential conflict of interest is for those groups that aren't really performing blastocyst culture effectively. And so if you can't make a blastocyst, again, you have a conflict of interest in saying whether or not something works or doesn't work if you can't actually do it yourself. And I think both of those points aren't really recognized when we talk about conflict of interest. But obviously there is a conflict of interest on the other side, as I mentioned, and there's a lot of competition in the field to have the best test available in the market. And I do think that that's actually driven us to suggest we can do things that we can't actually do in order to gain commercial advantage. And again, that's, in my opinion, relevant to what we're seeing in terms of overestimation of mosaicism. Also, people have suggested that after my lecture, I tried to suggest that mosaicism doesn't actually exist, and that's not true. I do believe it does exist, but as I show you, I think that it's relatively rare. And again, that's why I think it's really a waste of time to talk about it as much as we do, to spend as much money on it as we do. And I do think it negatively affects how we treat patients. And one of the issues I have is when publication doesn't at least acknowledge that, yes, there are some technical artifacts that can lead to overestimation of mosaicism. As I'll show you, there's very little data on whether or not a mosaic prediction in one biopsy of an embryo predicts what's actually present in the remaining embryo, and I think there was a question earlier about this, so I'll address that. And very little validation in terms of predictive value of outcomes, even within the existing embryo, as I suggested. What we do know is that the primary origin of aneuploidy is maternal meiosis, and because of that, we should expect that the majority of aneuploidy in the embryo is uniform, not mosaic. this is looking at post-implantation products of conception. Again, the majority is not mosaic. And there are data, including this, which suggests that the majority of aneuploidy in the pre-implantation stage originates from maternal meiosis and is therefore not mosaic. So why do we see these high estimates of mosaicism? And I think, again, one thing to consider is whether or not the techniques give you high accuracy in order to make predictions. Particularly on single cells, as we heard, it's more difficult to get an accurate diagnosis. In this paper, they took apart cleavage stage embryos and looked at multiple blastomeres from each of those embryos using array CGH, which we heard about earlier. But in this study, there was not a single meiotic aneuploidy observed. So I think you should have cause for reflection here in terms of whether or not we should trust all of the data in this particular study. But at minimum, they should acknowledge that there's the potential for technical artifact to contribute to overestimation of mosaicism. And we do actually have comparison studies looking at the performance of array CGH and qPCR using SNP array as a third test to determine which of the two tests was accurate to begin with. And in that, we found a 9% false positive rate with array CGH. Now, this was actually done on blastocyst biopsies, and so you can imagine performance on single cells may be even worse. But the point is that as soon as you evaluate 10 or more cells in a single embryo, all of those embryos are going to be predicted to be mosaic with array CGH. And so if you were to apply that math in this study, you would expect 47% mosaicism prediction, not because the embryos are mosaic, but because of technical artifact. So again, I'm not saying all of these results are due to technical artifact, but at minimum, we should acknowledge that they can contribute to overestimation. We also have an issue with how we classify embryos as mosaic. And I think you might agree that the strongest evidence is when you take multiple biopsies and you see a reciprocal aneuploidy here, a trisomy of chromosome 15 and a monosomy of the same chromosome in that same embryo. And this is reflective of a mitotic non-disjunction event, and you would consider that to be bona fide mosaicism or the strongest evidence. It's less likely to be due to artifacts in the test and more likely to be real. And if you go from left to right, you can see various forms of reciprocal errors, multiple biopsies with the same error, all the way down to what is being used clinically, which is the intermediate copy number value. So when instead of getting a full 3 copies or 1 copy, you get something in between. And that's being considered as evidence, actually as a definitive diagnosis of mosaicism, which I think is a big mistake. And there are various ranges using this method, 3 to 20% or even higher. And that really reflects essentially different laboratories changing their threshold for calling something abnormal or normal. When we look at multiple studies that have taken apart embryos, this goes back to one of the questions I think Jerry asked about what the predictive value of one biopsy is for the rest of the embryo. But when you take apart embryos and use a little bit more rigorous interpretation of the data, not just intermediate log2 ratios, overall it's about 6% of the embryos, so relatively low. We saw some of the data on performance of different methodologies where you can look at artificial mixtures, and there are several studies now published where they've performed mixing of normal and abnormal cells to look at the sensitivity of detecting mosaicism or aneuploidy in a mixture. And this is nice. It can show you that, yeah, the test is capable of picking up mosaicism. But we have to look at it in a couple of ways. And first, just to point out, actually, qPCR in this situation was equivalent to next-gen sequencing for detecting aneuploidy in these mixtures. And that's when using default settings provided by Illumina for BlueFuse analysis of the next-gen data. Now, again, what I mentioned is that people have developed their own criteria for interpreting mosaicism, and so if you change the threshold, you can make the same test more sensitive. So instead of using default settings, you actually change the thresholds, and you start picking up more of these abnormalities more often. So you can have a significant improvement in sensitivity. But the issue with that is that you start picking up things that aren't real. And this is one of the types of false positives you can have with changing thresholds to be more sensitive. You decrease the specificity. And so, for example, you would call this mosaic when we know it wasn't actually mosaic, and this can be caused by artifacts in the technology. It actually led to a 33% false positive rate when using a published set of thresholds for predicting mosaicism. Here we go. So I think this is one of the most important publications surrounding mosaicism. It's gotten a lot of attention. You can see 120 citations in the 3 years since it was published. And of course, I have a little different perspective on this. Again, one thing is just to acknowledge that there could be potential for artifacts to have influenced these predictions. So alternative explanations, and instead of assuming that, for example, all of these abnormalities were present and they self-corrected or were lost during development, perhaps they were never abnormal to begin with. And instead, these were false positive mosaicism predictions. And that's why they led to a healthy euploid newborn. I think at least acknowledging that potentially could have happened here is important for us. And now, what people have typically argued is that, well, they must work because so-called mosaic embryos have reduced reproductive potential compared to embryos predicted to be euploid. And so, again, you can think about this in a different way. What if these were actually uniformly aneuploid? We know that full aneuploid embryos have a lower reproductive potential. So again, this is a potential false positive mosaicism prediction in embryos that are actually uniformly aneuploid. And if we go back to a study published by my former group, where we transferred 99 embryos blindly, so we biopsied them, but we did not use the results of the aneuploidy screening, and we asked whether or not, for example, here 99 embryos with aneuploidy had reproductive potential, and we found that 4% actually did lead to delivery. Now, instead of assuming that they're all mosaic, we actually did acknowledge that there is the potential for laboratory misdiagnosis. Again, I think this is important to acknowledge when we look at these types of data. The other issue I have here, and I've said this publicly in a reply to a review that we wrote, that I think supplementary data, raw microarray data, should be published. And in this situation, the New England Journal of Medicine actually requires that the array data be submitted, but thus far it has not been submitted for the paper that I've just been talking about. And it's not just important for people like me to evaluate the data to see whether or not it follows the interpretations made by the authors. And this is just showing that, yes, I have actually published several raw data sets for people to review. The important point of this is, and let me go back, you can actually submit next-gen sequencing data as well. So again, I think this is important going forward, that people make these data available publicly. And one of the reasons is that we continue to develop new algorithms, including this one that's been marketed by Cooper Genomics, that we could consider looking at historical data to see if it improves how we interpret results. But obviously we can't do that if the data is not made publicly available. Okay, now how am I doing on time? I think another important feature is what is the predictive value of mosaicism finding on a single biopsy? It's been very hard to find studies that have performed rebiopsies of embryos with an original prediction of mosaicism, but I'll show you a couple of examples. The other way that you might consider looking at this is when we do transfer a so-called mosaic embryo, do we have any validation that we see that later in development? And thus far, there are actually 0 true positives finding mosaicism in products of conception after transferring an embryo that has been predicted to be mosaic. And I think that's a big issue. If we look at studies that did perform rebiopsies, and again, it's actually very difficult to find anything, and these are just two abstracts I'm going to show you. It may be hard to see, but the concordance is relatively low, 31% in the ICM, 17% in the trophectoderm, which actually indicates that these mosaic predictions are not really predictive of what's remaining in the embryo. Another study looked at 20,000 embryos, and they had a more conservative threshold for predicting mosaicism. So instead of 20%, they found a 3% mosaicism rate. But when asked about studies where they performed rebiopsies on these embryos, in a third of those cases, they found uniform aneuploidy in the remaining embryo. Again, this is consistent with the idea that there could be false negative uniform aneuploidies being called mosaic instead of, again, uniform aneuploid. And how that might happen is shown here. For example, you have mosaic range trisomy 13, but then on rebiopsy you find uniform levels of trisomy 13. And just briefly, you saw some data on qPCR, but the same kind of amplification kinetics apply to whole genome amplification. So if you have a trisomy chromosome present in the sample, it will amplify sooner than a disomy chromosome. But if you, for example, had too many cells or you amplified it too long, instead of having this big difference between trisomy and disomy, later in the amplification you might see a much smaller difference. And so this could be a source for finding false negative uniform aneuploidy. And again, most of what we're doing is interpreting these intermediate copy numbers as mosaic, as definitive evidence of mosaicism. And I want to show you an example where that's not the case. Here you can see intermediate copy numbers for chromosomes 6, 13, and 16, which would indicate that this embryo is mosaic. And what you can do with some technologies, we heard about combining genotyping with copy number, and one of the things you can do with genotypes is look at the allele ratio. So for example, here you can see 3 clusters. This indicates that instead of having 2 copies of each allele, you have 3 copies, and this would indicate, again, a trisomy. And you can see that pattern for most of the chromosomes. When you look at the mosaic range monosomy 13, it actually looks like there are 2 copies. So you have 50-50 ratio of the heterozygous SNPs. And then there are other examples where you see again that it looks like there may actually be 4 copies. So in reality, this is a near triploid sample, which you would not be able to predict just using copy numbers. But if you were only using copy numbers, you would predict this to be a mosaic embryo when it's actually not. And if we look at the overall prevalence, several studies have suggested that it's somewhere between 1 in 100 to 1 in 200 embryos that have triploidy. So again, this could be a source of over-predicting mosaicism when the origin is actually triploidy. And several studies actually have indicated sort of a trend towards not reporting mosaicism altogether. In this report, 88% of clinics opted out, and in another study, 74% of clinics don't use mosaicism testing. So I'm going to actually propose some ideas about how we might move forward with looking at mosaicism. While I think it's relatively infrequent, I think one of the unexplored areas of research is around time-lapse, which I think we were all very optimistic about, and maybe we tried to stretch it too far to predict aneuploidy in general. And when you think about mitotic errors, they actually originate during the time of observation. And we did a pilot study looking at embryos that were definitively diagnosed as mosaic. That, again, is where you have a monosomy of 1 chromosome and a trisomy of the same chromosome within 1 embryo. So these are 4 test results, rebiopsies of embryos that were originally called aneuploid. And then upon reanalysis of the rest of the embryo, you could define this particular embryo as bona fide mosaic. Or alternatively, when you find consistency throughout the embryo, uniform aneuploid embryo. And it turns out that there were some significant time-lapse parameters that could predict the difference between these two. including the time to first cytokinesis and the interval between the 5-cell stage and early cavitation. So I think this warrants follow-up, that we might have a way to develop a non-invasive predictor of mosaicism through time-lapse. We've also seen the presence of micronuclei in blastomeres here and here, which are associated with a gain of here chromosome 15, and then lack of those micronuclei in blastomeres with a loss of chromosome 15. So reciprocal aneuploidies, bona fide mosaicism associated with micronuclei. And we know that it's possible to evaluate multinucleation and micronuclei using time-lapse. So again, this could be an area of further development to develop what I think might be a more accurate method for predicting mosaicism as opposed to using intermediate copy numbers. So mosaicism exists but is overestimated by imperfect methods and lacks criteria. Intermediate copy numbers can originate from phenomena other than mosaicism, and results from a single biopsy should not be considered a definitive diagnosis of mosaicism. I would encourage everyone doing research in this field to consider that. Instead of saying in your title that mosaic embryos do this, mosaic embryos do that, what if they're not actually mosaic? So at least consider that while these tests can detect mosaicism, a pattern that is consistent with mosaicism doesn't always mean that the embryo is mosaic. Future directions, I think we need to make raw data available for the scientific community to be able to investigate new algorithms that could be better at predicting these. We need more studies that have performed rebiopsies on embryos that have been classified as mosaic. I think there should be more systematic analysis of products of conception after the transfer of a so-called mosaic embryo. And I do think that the future work with time-lapse could be important to developing more accurate methods. And here's just a list of publications for those of you who would like to know whether or not I was cherry picking. Thank you.